So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar looking at what the NHS can learn from housing associations on driving and measuring social value. People are just coming in to the webinar, so we'll just give it a few minutes, maybe just 1 minute, and hopefully a few more people would turn up before we get going with the actual presentations and the conversation. So please do bear with us. Actually, I think we'll get going. So, as I say, good morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Van Doorn. I'm the Chief Executive of HACT, and HACT is a UK-wide innovation agency that works in social housing to kind of drive value, insight, and collaboration in the world of social housing. And we do a lot at the interface between housing and health, and particularly looking at how do we develop better relationships and collaboration and innovation between social landlords and NHS providers. So we're here today as part of a series of webinars that we're doing with the Health Anchor Learning Network, looking at a range of different issues that in the world of social housing we've been working on for some time, and particularly issues that we think that we've got something to share, and we'd like to help our colleagues in the NHS learn about what we've been doing over many, many years in being anchor institutions. And we appreciate that the concepts of anchor institutions and what that means in practice is something that we're all working out at the moment. And it's really great to be working with the Health Anchor Learning Network to kind of share our experiences, but also to work with you to look at how we can start to collaborate more in this space. This webinar is also being recorded, so hopefully people can kind of come back if they want to kind of look further at some of the conversations that we're about to have, or even share that with your colleagues so people can learn more broadly about what we are doing. The way we're going to run this session is that we're going to start off with a bit of a presentation from myself, and then we're going to hear from two other people who work in social housing. Phil Miles, who's the director of Clarion Futures, which is part of Clarion Housing Group, and they're the largest social landlord in the country. And then we're going to hear from Deborah Williams, who is the social impact manager at Sovereign, and Sovereign are also a very large organisation. And we'll hear from both of those about how they've started to take social value and the measurement of social impact and kind of integrate that into their organisations, and also into the impact that they're making at a local level in communities. And both are quite large organisations. As I said, Clarion is the largest social landlord, 135,000 homes, and they operate across multiple geographies in most parts of the country. So we're going to particularly look also at the kind of question of how do larger organisations, and of which in the NHS, many of the trusts are actually quite large organisations working across large geographies, and the ICSs are certainly even larger than that. How do we, as larger organisations across multiple places, actually make social value and social impact meaningful at a local level? The other thing we're going to do is that we've got the chat open, and so please do use the chat if you want to kind of share any thoughts or insights as we go through. Please also use the question and answers and put any questions you have for us and for the panel, and at the end we'll come back as a panel and we'll talk about and hopefully answer some of your questions. And if we can't answer your questions today, then there'll be opportunities to follow up after the webinar. So I'm going to get going with kind of what does this all mean in housing. And what I want to do first of all is look at the work that we've been doing in social housing now for about kind of 6 or 7 years. I want to look at kind of some of what is social value, the key drivers and concepts that we use in this space. I'm then going to introduce you to the approach that we've developed in social housing, looking at using wellbeing valuation. And then looking at the future developments. I'm going to share a little bit of insight about a piece of work that we've done recently with NHS Devon, looking at one of the Cavell centres that's being developed there. So I think when we think about social value, we often think about the legislative framework that underpins some of this within the public sector. And for those of you who don't know, social housing organisations, social landlords are public procuring authorities in exactly the same way as the NHS is. So they're covered by the same legislation that you are in the NHS about how we go about procurement. And the Public Services Social Value Act in 2012 was quite an important moment in how when we're thinking about spending resources, commissioning and procuring services, that we should be taking the economic, social and environmental well-being of an area into consideration. And there was a moment in time when actually that was put into the legislation was put before Parliament, and there was consensus across all parties that this was the right thing to do about it in the public sector. December last year, we saw government produce its social value model. And this is the first time really that government has tried to kind of bring together a range of thinking that says these are the kinds of things that they expect to happen around procurement in particular. And what was important about that was that even though at the time this social value model was very much driven through kind of national government, it kind of set the framework for what they expect to see across the broader public sector. And it was responding in particular to the where we found ourselves in December around the pandemic. And in some respects, if you look at the things on the screen there, they're the kind of things that are really important to us now, because even though we're now kind of 9 months on from that, they're still the kind of issues that the government is saying from a social value perspective, these are the things that matter to them. It was followed up earlier this year by kind of public procurement notice, number 5. And actually what that then did was say that in all public procurement, so that covers housing associations as much as it covers you, that they wanted to see a focus on these areas, creating new businesses, jobs and new skills, tackling climate change and reducing waste, and improving supplier diversity, innovation and resilience. And therefore expecting to see kind of the national priorities reflected in how this happens locally through procurement. But I think I want you to see this word impact, and I want you to think about impact as we go throughout this whole presentation, because in housing, as much as it is in the NHS, that when we think about social value, we have to think about what is the impact we're driving. We can think about all the different types of impact that we might be driving, but fundamentally, if we're not delivering impact, we're not creating value. And too often, I think in social value terms, we spend a lot of time kind of measuring the nuts and bolts of social value. We forget that actually it's the impact that we're driving, the change that we are driving, that is actually the social value that's being created. So for us in housing, we've done a lot of work in thinking about, well, how do we measure this? You know, if we believe we're driving impact and delivering impact, how do we actually measure it? So for us, social impact measurement is concerned with assessing whether or not an intervention or action was in society's interests. And what do we mean by that? And that's a really good question. What is to be in society's interest? How would you begin to measure that? And for us in housing, we felt and we developed a whole approach around well-being as the way in which we would measure impact. There's a number of ways in which we begin to measure social value or social impact. There can be a kind of a secondary benefit approach, which is often the savings to the state, or what we think is important is a primary benefit approach, and that's the impact to the individual. And we looked at well-being as kind of the way in which we would understand the valuation of social impact. So what impact does, for example, getting a job have on improving somebody's well-being? And well-being is a legitimate policy goal, and it's something which has gathered a significant amount of interest, not just in the UK, but also more broadly across the globe. And social value is one of those things where actually what we've been doing for some time is making decisions. We make decisions about whether we invest in X or Y, or A or B, and is doing one thing better than doing another thing. So in some respects, from a social value perspective, we are already making those decisions. But often those decisions are implicit rather than explicit. So from a social impact measurement perspective, what we try to do is say, well, let's make it explicit. Let's look at what is the improvement to well-being of doing one thing or doing another thing. So social value for us, there's a few things we need to talk about. First of all, it's not necessarily intrinsically good. There's no such thing as social value. Listening to people isn't valuable, and gathering lots of data on what impact we make isn't important. And of course, there's qualifications to this. So social value work is not necessarily intrinsically good unless we understand what social value means. And we need to think very carefully about what it means for us, not only as a society, but what it means for us as organisations and as leaders in trying to make change. There is no such thing as social value unless it delivers impact for people. And I'm going to keep coming back to this concept. If we're not making impact, we're not driving value. And making impact has to be the thing that we seek to do. The valuation of that then comes second. We need to listen to people. Or actually listen to people isn't valuable unless we are prepared to respond. And I think there's a really important part about being connected to the issues going on for people in their communities and thinking about the impact we want to make alongside those and alongside them. And then finally, gathering lots of data on what impact we make isn't important unless we use this information to shape and plan services. So social value isn't just about reporting back on stuff we've done and giving ourselves a pat on the back. Social value is about using social value and social impact as a way in which we define and our services going forward, how we improve our services going forward, and then actually how we make more impact. So there's a golden thread in social value we have to be concerned about and we have to demonstrate. And that is, again, social value is only delivered when social impact is achieved. It only happens if it is actually rooted in the outcomes and the needs of a local community. And then when we draw our golden thread, we know what people want, we know what they need, and that comes from a range of different places and ways to understand that. We then design things that will deliver that impact, and then we spend our resources on that, and then we can measure the value of that. And that golden thread is really, really important. And the golden thread continues into the future about how we then assess and redesign our services on the back of the information that we have. So the approach that we took in HACT and with the social housing sector was around wellbeing valuation. And we wanted, and for organisations like housing associations operating, many of whom operate across lots of geographies, lots of communities, it was about making sure that we weren't tying ourselves up in knots, that we had a robust system that was kind of rooted in the best of government guidance in this space, that it was a methodologically consistent approach around different outcomes, and also that it was something that people could pick up and use and deploy quickly to generate powerful information. So wellbeing evaluation does that. It means that we can look at the different types of impact that might be made, getting a job or volunteering or improving your health or resolving your issues around homelessness, and looking at what is the primary benefit. And we do that by looking at very large data sets and looking at changes in life satisfaction, and then isolating those outcomes that are achieved in those data sets against the changes in life satisfaction. A way to think about that is here on the screen. So big data sets, understanding society, British Household Panel Survey, crime survey, those kinds of things. Ask well-being questions at the beginning, and they're standard questions asked by that you then see in ONS surveys across the piece. We then look at what changes in life satisfaction are happening because someone achieves an outcome. So for example, here, if someone moves into employment, that improves their life satisfaction by 1.5 index points. And we also know that you would need an equivalent amount of nearly £14,500 to be able to achieve the same change on the index. So we can then say that gaining employment is worth £14,500. But let's be clear, this isn't actually an exchange of money. There's no actual financial return. They don't represent savings to the state, and they're not money in the pocket of the participant. But what they do represent is a well-being uplift. And it's important to have a common metric, and that pound sign is our common metric. And in some respects, if we've become very used to economic analysis, this social value analysis can be put alongside that from an economic perspective. So a really simple kind of theory of change, and this is something we use in housing. We have community investment programs, so they're the kind of work that housing associations do in communities, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. They deliver outcomes. Outcomes improve well-being, and well-being has a value to society. And you can look at a whole range of different outcomes that do that. And what we now have is a UK Social Value Bank. It's there, it is available on our website, and it describes about 120 different outcomes. And it describes those outcomes just like this. So for example, full-time employment, it differentiates between age, also differentiates between London and the rest of the country. And in the analysis, we found there was very little difference between, say, Manchester or Cornwall or Plymouth or Newcastle or Nottingham, but there was a big difference between London and the rest of the UK. The social value calculator has 10 domains, and we're expanding this at the moment, that look at a whole range of different outcomes. So these are the ones that matter to housing associations, but to be honest, these are the kinds of outcomes that can be achieved by any organisation, including those working in the NHS. And the other thing that we did is we looked at WENWEBs, looking at mental well-being, and so we've also produced another calculator which kind of can put that pound sign, that improvement in well-being, alongside the WENWEBs tool as well. So where are we now? In housing, this is still very new. It's still something we're finding our way on. We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, but actually we recognise that it's certainly not something that we feel we've cracked. It's something that we are always learning. It is about moving it beyond community investment for us, because whilst community investment for housing is a big area of our work, we spend £750 million a year doing it. Actually, it matters across a range of different things that we do in housing, improving people's homes, the whole kind of the decarbonisation agenda. We're looking at how do we measure social value there as well. We are moving from a kind of a position of looking backwards to looking forwards, and how we start to use social value to plan for work and to plan our investments. ESG, environmental, social and governance, which is a part of the kind of the investment community at the moment, is driving a bit of impact in our sector. Obviously, procurement's been a big focus for us, but it's certainly not the only focus. Procurement is one way in which we can generate social value. We do it in so many other ways, and so does the NHS. And actually having a whole account is really important. But we also recognise we're learning our way in the procurement space too. And I think actually for me, what I observe and what I think is really important is we're beginning to unlock the transformational perspective of social value. And I think too often we can get locked in how we approach this from a transactional perspective. And procurement's a very transactional space. But when we think about whole organisations, and actually for those working in the ICSs, when you think about collection of organisations all working together as anchor institutions, the transformation that you're seeking to make in the places in which you work is really important, and therefore social value needs to talk to that rather than just the transactions that you're making. And for us in the housing, we've got a big program going on, which we call our social value roadmap. If you want to know any more about it, have a look on our website. And what we're doing is we're building out a much more powerful way in which we understand social value, and driving it through decisions, and driving it into investment, and actually driving it into the core of who we are as social landlords, as kind of anchor institutions in those communities, working alongside people in those communities as well. I'm going to end by just giving you an example of how we've started to apply this in the world of the NHS. So we've recently done an analysis for NHS Devon as part of the Cavell centres, and these are centres which are being developed to kind of provide not just kind of connection between health and social care services in a building, but also a whole range of other services, particularly those from the voluntary community sector. And NHSEI wanted to know what's the social value that's being driven as part of the economic case for investment. And we were asked, could we come and do a piece of work? So what we wanted to do was look at that potential development and ask, what does the community need? What could be driven, and what social value could be attached? So basically, it was a very simple way in which we did it. We wanted to understand the local needs, and the local NHS and their partners have done a range of community consultations. So we took that, and we took the work that had been done on service design, and we asked the question, okay, so if you're meeting local needs and you are redesigning services in this building, what are the outcomes that could be achieved, or the additional outcomes that could be achieved by everyone coming into this building and doing things differently? And we looked at a range of outcomes that mattered to local people and mattered to other local stakeholders, and their employment, apprenticeships, training, etc. We then asked, what's the social value that can be driven through the capital development stage, the construction stage, and then what's the social value we could drive through the post-occupancy stage, so when people are actually working together? And we did a 10 and a 12-year analysis and came up with a pretty conservative figure of £92 million. We've been asked to look at extending that for another 10 years, and we're doing that work with them at the moment. So that was an example of how we started to bring social value into that kind of planning space for the NHS as part of the decision-making process, as part of understanding the impact that you can make in your neighbourhoods, and doing it in a very simple way that focuses on impact or focuses on outcomes, and then starts to model what changes are being made for the local community and then valuing those changes. And if you want to know more, there's some examples of the people at HACT who you could contact with myself, our head of impact, James, and our head of research. Before I ask Deb and James to come, Phil to come in, I just want to say, if you're here wanting to know more about the learning network, you probably know about it, why you're here, but actually do engage with the learning network, because part of what we're trying to do in our work with them, but what they're trying to do more broadly is help you as a community of people kind of learn from each other and stay connected and make the best of all of the challenges that you've got ahead of you about how you be that anchor institution and be that impactful organisation in the future. I'm going to unshare my screen. I hope. And then I'm going to ask Phil and Deb to come in. There we go. So thank you very much. So first of all, we're going to hear from Phil and Deb. So we've got Phil and Deb with us. Both turn their screens on. Hello, Phil and Deb. Phil in the grass, Deb less in the grass, but greenery in the background. As I said, so Phil is the director of Clarion Futures, and Deb is the social impact manager at Sovereign. And I've asked them just to come along to kind of share with you their perspective on this, what they've been doing as driving this through in their organisations. I'm going to go over to Phil first.
Thanks very much, Drew. And hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. So I'll say a little bit about Clarion Housing Group just to start with, just to give a bit of context. So as Drew said, we're the largest social landlord in Europe, 125,000 properties and 350,000 customers. And actually that makes us a very large and complex organisation. We've got 4,000 staff and a £1 billion turnover. And we're also a huge developer as well. We're building 3,000 to 4,000 new properties every year. And we operate all over England. So as Drew says, we're involved in many of the most deprived communities in this country, because inevitably social housing is probably linked with deprivation wherever we operate. But like most housing associations, we see our role as more than being a landlord and a developer. So we have a very large community investment programme. And as Drew alluded to, that covers a whole raft of things like helping our residents into work, helping them have a bit more money in their pocket and avoid debt and make some savings, getting them online, for instance, and actually improving their local community and reducing crime and supporting our young people to get a better start in life. And increasingly also supporting our older vulnerable residents to feel a bit less lonely and a bit more connected. And that's what Clarion Futures does. So that I'm the director of that programme. And like most organisations, we're pretty good at counting stuff. You know, we're very good at counting how many new homes we build. We're very good at counting how many new kitchens and bathrooms we've installed. In my area, we're very good at counting how many people we've got into work and how many we've helped to volunteer and get apprenticeships and things like that. But actually, you know, it rather begs the question, you know, housing associations are businesses for social purpose. We exist to improve the world. We choose to do it largely by tackling the lack of affordable housing, but that still leaves a question hanging in the air for our boards about, you know, if I've got 10 million quid to spend on good work, should I put that into building more homes? Should I put it into more kitchens and bathrooms? Should I put it into helping Phil and his gang to help more people into work, etc.? And that actually is the question that prompted us to get involved with the very initial work to set up the Social Value Bank. So we've been involved all the way through from the beginning, and I must admit it took me a while to get my head around the concept of well-being. But actually once you think about it, and you think about the importance of good neighbours, having friends, being involved in your community, having access to nature and open space, these are the things that are incredibly hard to actually monetize the value of that. And of course, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that those things are the things that count when you really need them. And I hope that has really led actually to an increase in interest in this whole area. And so for us, particularly in our community investment team, having the Social Value Bank has helped us to quantify the overall impact of what we have. So we use the Social Value Bank to count up all the stuff that we do, helping people into work, helping them tackle their debts, etc. And we come up with a number each year for our total impact, which is normally over £100 million a year. And I have to say that is well anticipated in the organisation when that figure comes out, and it's reported in our annual accounts alongside all the financial stuff that sits there. And as Drew says, I think the power of the social value wellbeing methodology is that it's fine within community investment, but over time we are starting to make inroads to the rest of the organisation. And actually we do use social value appraisal as part of some of our financial appraisals around new schemes and new developments. And on our regen schemes, it's also used to help convey the impact, the broader impact, in exactly the example actually that Drew gave about the health centre. If we're seeking planning permission for, say, to regenerate an estate, if we can demonstrate the wider benefits to the local economy and the local community, that helps us give a much stronger ask for what we're wanting to do. And Drew also mentioned the ESG agenda, and that is something that's becoming very important to us as organisations, because we do receive quite a lot of institutional investment. A lot of the building that we do is actually funded through bonds, through loans, and hopefully increasingly potentially through pension fund investment and things like that. And those investors are actually wanting a social return just as much as they want their financial return. So that's why I would commend you to look at the roadmap that Drew, the nice donut, the sort of circle shapes that Drew's slide had at the end, because we're now taking the 120 values that we've got and we're adding to them a whole raft of environmental stats, which are values which are really important to us, because for us, we've got a commitment to go net zero carbon by 2050. We've got huge issues around the energy efficiency of our stock, for instance, and fuel poverty. And also increasingly, people ask about the bottom line impact of what we do. And, you know, so what is the saving to the Treasury, for instance, from getting people into work? So all of this helps us build a picture that actually we're not just a landlord. We're actually having, when we house somebody in a safe, warm house, that means something more than just having a roof over their heads. It actually means that they can contribute to society and feel secure to take up work and get their children to schools locally and become part of their community. And that has a benefit to society beyond the actual financial benefit to us. So I would highly commend the wellbeing methodology. I think it really captures something that is actually very hard to capture otherwise. You know, how on earth would you capture the value of not being depressed, for instance, or, you know, volunteering or playing football or gardening? and things like that. And these are things that don't get enough space or airtime in society. And I hope that through the pandemic that will change going forward. I think that's enough from me. I'll pass on to Debs, and then we'll probably have some discussions later, hopefully.
Super, thanks Phil, and again really lovely to be here today. As Drew said at the beginning, I come from Sovereign. So Sovereign is another social housing I can't speak social housing provider in the south kind of end of England. So we cover Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Hampshire, Isle of Wight, and then downwards. We're around about half the size, I should imagine, of Clarion. We've got about 60,000 homes, I believe, so about half the size. Again, we have a bespoke community investment team who look after very similar things to Clarion Futures around supporting people with digital inclusion, employment and training, community development and engagement. Very, very similar setup. So what kind of occurred in our association probably around about 4 years ago now was that we looked at the amount that we were investing in communities, and for a housing association of our size we decided that what we were doing wasn't enough and we needed to do more. So around about 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, my role was created with the intent that we would begin to really get to grips with understanding the impact that we made in our community investment team, but then widen that out across the wider business as well. What we started with was a real strong emphasis from our executive board that they wanted to really understand the value and have a financial proxy that represented that value of the impact that was created through our work. And HACT's wellbeing valuation was the tool of choice, really, because it had such a plethora of different measures that we could choose from, many of which related to a lot of the wellbeing work that we were currently delivering and that which we wanted to deliver, but also some of the BAU instances like being able to improve EPC scores. And so it really was a representative tool for what we wanted to capture. So I probably spent the first year or so in post kind of trying to embed the use of the tool within our community investment team. And then what we've tried to do across the wider organisation, I'll reverse. It was fairly easy to implement it in our community investment team. We happen to be quite used to capturing evaluations and reflections and surveys of how people have changed as a result of our intervention. So that made embedding things like the survey questions in the wellbeing tool quite easy, because we've always tried to look for the so what of what we do. With the wider business, actually what I thought might happen would be that there was going to be some resistance to integrating some of those more complex before and after style measures, but I was very surprised in that what I was met with was quite a diverse range of teams from across the organisation looking at the wellbeing valuation and saying, oh my goodness, this is what we've been looking for, because we constantly count, I think of our tenancy support service, we constantly count how many engagements we have. And actually what we don't capture then is all the work that we've had to do to get a person to that point of being able to engage with our service. So all of the incremental steps, all of the continuing to go to the home and try and build their confidence up to get them out of the door in the first place is not even captured and not valued anywhere. So it was a surprisingly easy task to go out to some areas of the business and say, hey, look at this, do you fancy having a go? And actually they have. And one of the most exciting parts, I think, for us has been looking at its use similarly to, as you were saying, Phil, in things like regeneration projects and asset management. So we've worked with James, who was mentioned just now at HACT, to embed some of those measures and principles into our strategic asset management. So using the wellbeing valuation will directly impact the choices that we make on how to either sell a property if we need to sell it, or to refurbish it and get it up to scratch, or retrofit, or build new. And I think it's really exciting that in the organisation, the first question is, does our decision create a positive social impact? And if it's no, why are we doing it? So I think we're very, very much early days on this journey, and things are still changing, and that's okay. We're going to get stuff wrong. We're going to do it crazily in some ways and think, why on earth did we do that? But it's all part of that journey and that process, and looking at, okay, with that measure, does the work that it takes to get that measure give us the benefit that we want to see, or is that the right thing to do in this instance? But what we really see is that the social impact capture is really starting to drive that decision making in the business, and I think that's an incredibly powerful position to be in, when you can say, we know that what we're doing is the right thing because we can see that in doing it there is a positive change in our communities. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, and Phil, thank you too. So we've got a number of questions coming in. Please, either put your questions into the Q&A or put your questions into the chat. Don't mind, we're looking at both. And we're going to spend the next kind of 20 minutes just kind of having a conversation around some of those questions, about some of the issues around social value. Also, someone asked, is there a support group, a peer group for people who are working on social value? And they're using the if you are using the HACT calculator and you want to got any questions, then just do get in contact with us. We're happy to answer them. I appreciate that in some respects, because we're an organisation that works predominantly in social housing. Most of our networks are in social housing. So if people start using the NHS, we're happy to kind of establish groups of people who can support each other, because actually as I said, we're all finding our way in this space. No one has yet. I don't think anyone can say they've got the right answer. I think everyone is basically saying, we're kind of trying to work it out. But what's important is that we've got a new powerful piece of information. We've got a new way of really understanding our impact, and what that means. We're not quite sure yet how that we'll use that in all the things that we can do, but we know it's meaningful, and I think that's kind of where we are. So we've got a few questions. Phil, I'm going to ask you this question because you probably know the answer to this. Can you measure? Susanna Young asked, do you have a social value metric for homelessness prevention?
Yes. Yeah, well, we do actually. Yeah. So when we started, we were originally looking at community investment values. So getting people into work, volunteering, playing football, etc., youth work, etc. But the question rapidly arose that clearly we're obviously engaged in reducing homelessness in this sector. So is there such a thing? And I have to say, fair play to Symmetrica and HACT. They scoured the world looking for a homelessness data set, and they found one in Australia, quite a big data set. And from that, we were able to generate a number of different values, which do sit within the social value bank. Quite powerful actually, because they're different. They're values for taking a rough sleeper into temporary accommodation and then on to permanent. There are people in temporary accommodation onto permanent. So yeah, there is.
So thank you, Phil. So I'll answer. There's a technical question which I'm going to try and answer, which is about how do we actually calculate the pound, the value itself. And okay, so this is and is it quite complex? And that was asked by, let me find the person who asked. So that was from Selena Taylor. Okay, Selena, it is complex, but bear with me. I'm going to try and make it not complex. So the thing you need to know is that there are some really, really clever people with the biggest brains in the world, attached to places like the London School of Economics, who have been doing this work for us for some time, and it's all compliant with kind of Green Book guidance from the Treasury. So it's, and as I said, this is an emerging field, and actually the Green Book published a supplementary guidance just about a month ago, actually, looking at wellbeing value, looking at measuring wellbeing. So it is emerging. But it's pretty robust, and there's very bright people working on it. So for simple folk like me, I try and explain it this way. So in big surveys, and we use big surveys to look at kind of, and if you've ever kind of participated in, say, Understanding Society or the British Household Panel Survey, they ask you everything about your life that you didn't even know you needed to know, loads of questions. But in those big surveys, they put in what we call wellbeing questions, and they're often at the beginning. And they're a set of life satisfaction questions. So how are you feeling nowadays is kind of one of them. So they've started to insert them in lots and lots of different kind of surveys. So and these are often panel surveys that happen over long periods of time. So over time, you build up a really big data set of a whole range of different issues that people report on, and they report on their life satisfaction. So what we're doing is triangulating three pieces of information. One, we're looking at changes in life satisfaction. So we're able to say that, for example, by getting a job, for someone who was unemployed to get a full-time job, that improves their life satisfaction by 1.5 points on the scale. There's also another survey that looks at lottery wins, and they're not the big lottery wins, which are silly. It's looking at small lottery wins. So, what's important about small lottery wins is they're randomized. So you're able to say that, and they also ask the life satisfaction. So in that, they're also able to show that a move of 1.5 points on the life satisfaction scale is worth this amount of money. So then we just triangulate that information together. It's a really basic way of explaining it. It's a lot more complicated than that. And if you're that interested, there are methodology papers on our website which you can read and you can enjoy, and you can criticize, you can challenge, and all those things. But that's a really basic way of understanding how we come up with the pound sign. What's important is that we have to come up with a pound sign, because if we don't, we're not then able to use social value information alongside other economic information, which we're very used to doing. Hopefully that explains it. As I said, there are very detailed papers that explain it in more depth. Let's ask. There's a question here from Ralph. Alias, hello Ralph, from London Northwest Healthcare Maestros. I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to ask Deb or Phil, what do you think about this question?
Oh, do you know, I wanted to answer this one.
Yeah, but answer that question, because this is about choices. Tell us about choices.
Oh, hang on. Am I looking at the right question?
Yeah, so it says here, in the NHS
context? Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. So I saw this and I thought, it is a challenge, you're right. And then I started to think about what I would do if I was in that situation. And actually, we have found ourselves there in Sovereign a few times, because it can be challenging increasing headcount in most organisations. Increasing headcount is a challenge, isn't it? And I think what I would be looking at there is you're absolutely right. It's difficult to say we could invest 1 million into 20 new staff, or we could invest 1 million into a project that delivers something. I feel fairly confident that if you were to continue to track the line of impact that occurred on those 20 staff, you would probably generate an awful lot of social value impact anyway. So I don't necessarily think it is a question of having to pick one or the other. I think it's more a case of, where possible, trying to impact measure as much as you can so you can get the clearest picture of the impact generated by an organisation. And we've found at Sovereign that sometimes programmes that you don't expect to necessarily generate too much impact have generated a significant amount, and others haven't generated that much at all. So you find yourself having to almost not take an average, but you build a picture of the service as a whole, and the areas within that you want to support, and think, oh, actually, maybe we'll question doing that one next time. There are some things that we do that don't necessarily fit into the HACT wellbeing valuation, and we will never stop doing them because it's the right thing to do. And so it's really important to keep that sanity check in the back of your mind when you're deciding how and where you work. But yeah, I think that would be my answer, is try as much as you can to track everything, and then you'll get a full picture, and then it just starts to direct your thinking over time. It's not going to be an overnight, that's the decision we need to make.
What do you think of that question?
Yeah, so it's a great question, but I think it depends what A, those staff are doing, and B, what the alternative is as well. So, and I saw, Ralph, that you put a follow-up in there saying, but you can't measure the benefit to a patient. Well, the answer is you can, because if we were able to have a data set of hospital patients that measured, I mean, maybe if we had Understanding Society or the British Household Patient Survey, one of the questions could be in there about your health. Have you struggled with health issue recently? And if a question is asked of somebody, you can actually generate a value for it, because you could then isolate those group who do have a problem with their health, and there's been a change in the last year, and that will then impact on their life satisfaction. And also, you know, coming back to the homeless data set, if we're able to find a data set for homeless people, we can probably find a data set for people who are in hospital, and you can probably work out what are the best interventions to help their well-being go up. But to come back to your original point, it really depends who those staff are and what the alternative is. So, but what the social value measurement allows you to do is to compare the two. So, for instance, taking my example, if I spent £1 million on 20 new employment advisors, I would know that on average, one of our employment advisors helps 100 people into work. So I would know that I would get 2,000 extra people helped into work each year from that, and I can calculate social value for that. I could then work out, but if I spend that £1 million on helping young people to go to youth clubs, or on a health program, or a volunteering program, or apprenticeships, or something like that, I can calculate, and I could work out how many young people I would expect to work to support with that, and then calculate a social value, and then compare the two. That is the crux and the beauty, I guess.
Excellent. And I think what I would add to that is that actually, in response to your second question, Ralph, about kind of people would argue that the benefit to patients can't be given a value. Health economics does that all the time. You know, we have qualities in health. We kind of look at whether or not an intervention is going to improve, you know, the quality of life, and that's a health as a kind of economic efficiency measure. So we've been doing all that. We do that all the time. I think with social value, no one's saying that you shouldn't stop doing your core business. I don't think anyone's saying that. And actually, improving someone's health does have a well-being impact, and we can see that from the data. Improving someone's mental health also has a well-being impact. But what we also know is that there are lots of things that we can do that improves people's well-being. And I think the thing for us in health that we're being asked to think differently about is what else can we be doing with our resources and within our position in communities to be able to drive impact and drive change. And in some respects, that's the question we're asking in housing as well. So beyond just providing good quality homes and building new homes and refurbishing the homes we have, what more are we doing and what more can we do? Because we know that when society and people who live in our communities improve their well-being, that it has a lot of other impacts around as well. And there's lots of things that we can be doing and using our resources wisely and creatively to do that. And I think what the social value measurement does for us, it gives us more information about the choices that we are already making. And as I said earlier, it's about making the implicit explicit in our decision making. We've got a few other questions here, I think. So any thoughts on the question about kind of involvement from universities on conducting longitudinal studies on kind of longer term health outcomes, the longitudinal nature of impact in particular? Phil?
we certainly work with, for instance, Liverpool John Moores University on longitudinal studies of around our money guidance and budgeting support and things like that. So I would see no reason at all not to work with the universities on some of these, on particular elements. So say tracking mental health, for instance, or on the whole social value program as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a number of housing associations who are doing some of those longitudinal surveys as well. So Peabody, as part of the Thamesmead Major Regeneration, which is like 15-20 year program of work, are also kind of looking at how do you kind of track intervention, the impact that interventions make in those areas. And part of that are longer term health outcomes as well. And it kind of goes back a bit to the kind of the question of that's coming up in the chat around kind of population health management. You know, the concept that if we intervene early, we do things at an earlier stage, you can actually prevent ill health from arriving later in life. And how do we kind of shift resources into a more kind of upstream preventative mode rather than spend all our resources in crisis mode? And they're good questions. And in some respects, that's the proposition on the table for integrated care systems to try and tackle. And it's really hard to do that. But, you know, social value is a part of that consideration, because you might be surprised about the different types of things you can do that actually generate improved health outcome. Knowing that only 20% of all health outcome is derived by clinical intervention. The other 80% is derived by lots of other things like good housing and things like that. There's a technical question here which I will deal with and there's others want to. So if someone's moving to volunteering, what does it actually mean? So within the Social Value Bank, and I would say that this applies not only in the work that we do, but in any social value kind of work that you do. And in the same way that we do that within the delivery of the services in the NHS anyway, we've got to be able to assure ourselves that actually people have achieved outcomes. Because you can't just say, well, I think that some people have got a job or some people have gone into volunteering and therefore I'm going to claim that as social value. No, you've got to be able to demonstrate that. So there is an evidence requirement within the UK Social Value Bank. It's defined and it's aligned to the questions that are asked in those big surveys. So there's kind of fidelity between the analytical stage and then the outcome and the delivery stage for a social value measurement. The volunteering is regular volunteering, so that's at least once. So it's a volunteering on a regular basis is that you volunteer at least once a month over a 12-month period. That's basically the measure, and it sits there in the Social Value Bank. In the same way that if you're saying that someone's got a job, you've got to know that someone has moved from a position of being unemployed to being employed. So it's about impact, it's the change that's been made. The fact that someone might move from one job to another job doesn't mean that you've actually created any impact, because they just move from one job to another job. So actually what we're looking at, impact is about change and significant change, not just kind of shuffling the cards on the deck. Also, there's another question there about kind of how do we, who else is kind of adopting this approach? Is it happening in transport? Is it happening in education? I would say that the vast majority of organisations have adopted this approach so far have been local government, it's been housing associations, the broader third sector often measures its impact. It's big infrastructure, yes. So there's lots of analysis that's going on in big infrastructure around social impact. So HS2 has a whole social impact analysis done on it by Symmetrica Jacobs. And education is beginning to think in these terms as well, but it's certainly not an evolved kind of piece of work that goes on within education. In the same way, it's not very evolved in the NHS either. So different sectors are at different spaces, but I think there's an overall recognition that people are beginning to think that measuring and thinking about social value is an important aspect. Deb, what do you find in your relationships with kind of, because you work with lots of different contractors in the private sector, you work with lots of community organisations, how are they beginning to adopt this?
So I would say it's one of those unknown gems, I think, is what we find. We will often start working with a partner and kind of explain to them that this is what we use as a tool to measure performance and impact on whatever we fund. now, like we've got several partners who have now fully adopted it and who are using it for their normal practice. So those are all third sector. We've also had some grant giving agencies that are looking at considering adopting it into what they do. So these are like platforms such as Crowdfunder haven't adopted it yet, but are using the measures that we're asking them to and reporting back to us on what they deliver. But certainly there's like the Good Exchange, which I think they kind of sit in the Berkshire, Hampshire area of the UK, but are further spread as well and looking to expand. So we've got some grant giving platforms that are seeing the benefit of this as well. And some procuring partners. So we have a Social Value Exchange who look for social value opportunities through the supply chain on behalf of different organisations, and they're looking at adopting it as well. I think what we've seen in schools is a particularly interesting one. So I used to be a teacher, and in having links in with some of our local schools that we work with, it's actually been a really useful tool, not necessarily for the work. So speaking particularly in primary schools, because the Social Value Bank doesn't apply too much to that younger age range. So I think you need to be around about 10. Drew, correct me if I'm wrong, for the value to kick in, be active. So with primary, maybe not so much for the children themselves, but actually where you're doing work with parent liaison and with trying to integrate into communities and wider town council work, actually the schools have really embraced it and are starting to see that this is another way that they can tell their story. I think it's particularly powerful when you're looking for funding outside your statutory work. So we have had schools that have asked us to help them to understand the impact of the work that they've been doing with parent groups, just so that they can go on and apply for funding. So I think it is an unknown gem.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, Janine, you've put it in the chat that in your volunteer capacity in the arts sector, they've started to adopt it, and they have. There's lots of good work that's been done by our partner Symmetrica Jacobs on looking at attendance at museums, in gardens, national trusts. There's a whole range of things that are going on about the social value of participation, and also that extends into sport and other areas. Phil, we've got a couple of minutes. I want to ask you one of the questions that's come up, because this comes up a lot in our work. Does it matter, or when you're thinking about getting someone into employment, is there different social value if you're thinking about someone who's a bit closer to the labour market, or someone's a bit further away, or someone experienced more inequalities? What's your thought on that?
Well, it's a great question, actually. And I mean, as it happens within our sector, we tend to work only with our residents or people who live in the immediate community, and that inevitably means they're from a deprived background as often as not. So, I mean, anybody who wants a job and is capable of getting a job won't come to our employment advisors. Put it that way. I mean, the average amount of time that our advisors work with our residents is 6 months before they get a job. So. But to answer the question, there isn't a value. We don't differentiate by socioeconomic background. It would be wonderful if we could, but we've got age and geography. Those are the two kind of differentiators. It's maybe something we should look at, because we would probably find the value would be higher, actually, for some of our residents. Yeah. However, as a general point, I would absolutely recommend that you do take on people from deprived socioeconomic backgrounds.
The only thing I would add to that is what we tend to do with our employment and training service is that there are a whole host of other measures that are you could consider a secondary outcome. So we know that when somebody is working with our employment and training team, one of the frequent changes that happens in a person is that they become more confident and feel more in control of their life, both of which are measures. So although we can't necessarily define the socioeconomic kind of differences, what we can do is measure the additional changes on top of the employment itself.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. And I would also add that actually, sometimes if you make things overly complicated, then you've also got to know all the answers to the questions you're asking. So if you want to have lots of differentiated ways in which you're measuring impact, you've got to be prepared to be able to answer the question, what is the socioeconomic background of the person? What are all these things? Sometimes the data doesn't exist, but also it makes the collection of data more complicated. And what we're trying to do is make it as simple as possible. We could go on forever on this call, on this webinar. We're going to have to draw it to a close. And I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit, so just bear with me while I just try and bring this to a close. I think I'm going to quickly answer Andy's question. Andy, when it comes to impact, what you're focusing on is what is the impact that you're making, not whether or not there is a legislative framework within Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland or England that supports that. So actually the UK Social Value Bank can be applied anywhere. Each different kind of legislative frameworks might want to focus on certain things, but actually what sits there in the UK Social Value Bank is outcomes. And to be honest, helping people into a job in Wales is the same as helping people into a job across the border in England, in Shropshire, for example. So it's the same kind of thing. This has been really interesting, really exciting, lots of really good conversation. Well, let's continue the conversation. You've got our contact details. There's a lot that we can share from the world of housing. We can work with you at HACT. If you want us to help you, then just get in contact with us. You know, we are all at the beginning of this journey and how we use the social impact information in our organizations. There's lots that we can do. There's lots of things that we haven't even thought about that we can do. But actually, fundamentally, as anchor institutions, we've got to have a very clear perspective of impact. And if we can value the impact, we can then build that into our economic models as well and into our financial models. So thank you so much, Phil. Thank you so much, Deb, for being with us today and sharing your experiences. Thank you for everyone that's joined us. Thank you for all of the questions. Sorry we couldn't answer all of them. If you want to come back to the webinar, it has been recorded. If you want to continue the conversation, then get in touch. And I do hope you have a really good rest of your Friday and a good weekend ahead. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.